The image that won't leave me even now is a small square of shattered glass lying in a bed of pine needles, catching the last weak light of the day. The forest around it was almost painfully quiet, just the faint hiss of wind sliding through branches and the distant creak of trunks shifting against each other. A thin black band disappeared under the damp needles, the plastic slick with mud and grit when I brushed it with my fingertips. The air smelled like wet bark and cold stone, and the ground was soft enough that my knees sank slightly when I knelt there. Somewhere far off, a helicopter thumped against the sky, but down in that little gully, it felt like the sound couldn't quite reach us. I remember the way the screen, though cracked, seemed to stare back at me like a blind eye, dull and lifeless. One of the deputies told me not to touch it, his voice low and careful, like he was afraid of spooking something we couldn't see. My throat went dry, and all I could hear for a moment was my own breathing and the slow rasp of my jacket sleeve when I pulled my hand away. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back before any of that, the pine needles, the broken glass, the endless questions, my life was as ordinary as anyone's in our part of Colorado. I spent most days under fluorescent lights at the library, the air cool and dry, the faint hum of computers and the soft slap of book covers closing filling the space. Outside traffic on the main road in Lakewood made that constant low whooshing sound like a river of rubber and asphalt that never really slept. I'd drive home in the early evening with the sun low over the foothills, the clouds bruised pink and purple behind the dark line of the Rockies, and think about what to make for dinner, or whether I'd remembered to water the plant on my desk. The rhythm of my days was simple students asking for help, finding sources. The smell of old paper and coffee. My key turning in the lock of my small townhouse just after 6. Rachel's schedule, by contrast, never seemed to fit inside the usual shape of a week. The hospital where she worked ran on 12-hour shifts and crisis pacing, and there were nights when she'd call me on her way home as the sky over Denver was just starting to turn gray. I'd be standing barefoot in my kitchen, the tile cool under my feet, listening to the kettle hiss, while she talked about medication shortages or a patient's small victory, a fever that finally broke a family that got to go home. I could hear the fatigue in her voice, that roughened edge that comes from talking over monitors and alarms all day, but I could also hear something steadier beneath it, a sense of purpose that I never quite found in overdue book notices and copier jams. She'd joke that my world smelled like dust, and hers smelled like antiseptic, and somewhere between the two of us we covered most of what life threw at people. Our parents still lived in the same modest ranch house on a quiet street in Arvada, their front yard shaded by a maple tree that dropped helicopter seeds all over the sidewalk each spring. On Sundays, if Rachel was off, we'd gather there for dinner. The house always smelled like roasted chicken or tomato sauce, and the old ceiling fan in the dining room rattled softly overhead as we passed dishes back and forth. Dad would complain about changes in the electrical code, Mom would ask if I'd met anyone interesting at work, and Rachel would stare into her iced tea for a second before answering questions about the hospital. When she did talk, she used gentle words, busy long day, tough shift, and skipped over the kinds of details she didn't want to bring home. I remember the way her shoulders would slowly drop as the evening went on, tension unwinding under the warm lamplight and the clink of silverware. She had a way of carrying other people's pain without letting it show in her face, at least not right away. When we sat on my small balcony on warm nights, the metal railing cool under our arms, she would finally let little pieces of it leak out. The sound of cicadas buzzed from the trees behind my building, and traffic in the distance softened into a low hush. Rachel would curl her bare feet up on the chair, cradling a mug of herbal tea, and stare out at the faint line of the foothills. "I just need space," she'd say sometimes, the words coming out on a long breath. Like actual space, not just the 5 minutes between alarms. Her eyes always drifted toward the west when she said it, where the mountains rose up dark and solid against the fading light. That's where the hiking came in. If the hospital was where she poured herself out, the trails were where she refilled. She treated them like a ritual, checking weather reports, laying out her gear the night before, charging her devices on the counter by the fridge. Her apartment always smelled faintly of dryer sheets and detergent, and the soft scrape of her boots on the kitchen tile as she tested the laces was a familiar sound. She kept her backpack packed with the same careful checklist every time: extra socks, a small first aid kit, an emergency blanket still folded in its crisp packaging, and an array of granola bars she called insurance. To anyone else, it might have looked like overkill for a day hike. To her, it was just respect for the landscape that had raised us. We grew up camping in those mountains. Some of my earliest memories are of waking up in a tent to the cold dampness of morning air on my face, the smell of campfire smoke still clinging to our sweatshirts from the night before. Dad would shuffle around outside, the sound of the cooler lid thumping shut, metal pans clinking as he set them on the little propane stove. Rachel and I would untangle ourselves from sleeping bags and argue over who had to step onto the cold ground first, while Mom unzipped the tent flap and let in that blinding, pale mountain light. Those trips taught Rachel where the sun would fall on a south-facing slope in the afternoon, how quickly the temperature dropped when clouds slid over the peaks, and what it felt like when the wind picked up in a way that meant something was changing. As adults, those lessons turned into habits. If she knew she had a stretch of days off coming up, she'd text me midweek with a photo of some trail map she'd printed from a website. The blue lines of creeks and the squiggle of switchbacks would be dotted with her neat handwritten notes in pen. Thinking Saturday, she'd write, "Moderate good views, no sketchy drop-offs." The light from her apartment ceiling fixture would shine on the map when I stopped by, the glossy paper cool and smooth under my hand when she slid it across the table to show me. I'd trace the route with my finger while the refrigerator hummed in the background, nodding along, even if I had no intention of dragging my knees up another mountain that week. What always struck me was how careful she was. She treated her phone and her watch like lifelines, not accessories. The soft chime of her smartwatch was a regular sound in her apartment, reminding her to stand to drink water, to check her messages. She had location sharing turned on with me all the time, not just for hiking. On late nights when she was driving home from the hospital on I-70, the highway lights throwing long white streaks on her windshield, I could open an app and see that little dot moving steadily closer. The glow of my phone screen would light up my bedroom in the dark, casting a faint blue on the ceiling as I watched her inch along the map. Only when I saw she'd reached home would I finally let myself drift off. Our relationship had the quiet rhythm that comes from surviving your 20s together and realizing you're the only two people who remember certain moments exactly the same way. There were evenings when she'd flop onto my couch, still in scrubs that smelled faintly of hospital air, disinfectant, recycled ventilation, and that metallic hint of worry you can't quite name. I'd hand her a blanket, the fleece soft under my fingertips, and we'd watch some show neither of us really followed, just letting the flicker of the screen paint shadows on the walls. She'd rest her head against the cushion and tap absent-mindedly on her watch, checking steps, heart rate, sleep tracking. "I like knowing where my body's at," she said once, shrugging. "I tell patients to listen to theirs. Feels only fair to listen to mine, too." The town around us moved on its own steady track. Late summer in our part of Colorado has a particular feel to it. The days are still warm enough that the pavement radiates heat in shimmering waves, but the evenings carry just a thread of cool air that smells faintly of dry grass and distant rain. Neighbors left their windows cracked at night, the click of box fans and the soft rattle of blinds mixing with the sounds of a passing train far off. On Friday nights, high school stadium lights cut sharp white rectangles into the dark, and you could hear the muffled rise and fall of crowds if you stepped out onto the sidewalk. Saturday mornings, the farmers' market tents bloomed in the grocery store parking lot, the air full of roasted chile peppers and coffee. In the middle of all that, our lives felt almost boring in the best possible way. I shelved books and helped community college students wrestle their way through citation formats. Mom tended to a small army of houseplants and dropped off leftovers in plastic containers that stacked up in my freezer. Dad tinkered in his garage, the smell of motor oil and sawdust lingering in his clothes. And Rachel, when she wasn't at the hospital, was either planning a hike coming back from one or talking about the next. It was the kind of stability you don't realize you're grateful for until something shakes it. Looking back, there were small moments that should have felt heavier than they did at the time. I remember one evening in late August, the sky outside my living room window streaked with that gold light that makes everything look almost too sharp. Rachel was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her back against the couch, her hair pulled up in a loose knot, scrolling through trail reports on her tablet. The fan in the corner pushed warm air around the room with a steady whir. "People get sloppy this time of year," she said almost to herself. "Weather's still good, so they think nothing bad can happen." I glanced over, heard the faint note of concern in her voice, but it slid right past me. I just laughed and told her she was the only person I knew who treated a casual hike like a military operation. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, and then the moment passed. There was another time early September when she came by my place after a run to test some new trail shoes. The rubber soles left faint prints of dust on my hardwood floor, pale against the darker wood. She pressed her thumb into the side of one shoe, checking the give, and told me about a nurse at the hospital who'd gone on a hike alone, ignored a warning sign about a washed-out section, and come back with a sprained ankle and a bruised ego. "You respect the mountain, or it reminds you who's in charge," she said, shaking her head. The air through the open window carried the smell of someone grilling nearby, and a dog barked down the street. I remember nodding, only half listening, my mind already drifting toward the work emails I knew were waiting for me. As summer leaned toward fall, she talked more often about wanting one last good high-country day before the snow really started to stick. The aspen leaves at elevation were just starting to think about turning, she said, and the mornings in the foothills came with a kind of chill that woke you up more efficiently than any coffee. She'd pull up satellite images on her phone, the screen casting a cool glow on her face in the dim light of my living room, tracing a finger along ridgelines and creek crossings. I could hear the faint buzz of her watch when notifications came in a tiny vibration against her wrist that she'd answer or ignore depending on her mood. The last ordinary evening we had together didn't feel like anything special at the time. It was a Thursday warm, but with that edge in the air that told you the season was shifting. The sky over the mountains had gone from orange to a deep, even blue by the time she swung by my place after a shift, her headlights washing over the front of my building before cutting out. Inside, the living room smelled like reheated pasta and the lemon-scented cleaner I'd used on the counters. She looked tired, but there was a brightness in her eyes, a kind of quiet excitement as she dropped onto the couch and stretched her legs out in front of her. "I think I found a good one for this weekend," she said, tapping her phone screen and turning it toward me. A trail map glowed softly in the dim room, all contour lines and shaded areas, the route highlighted in bright color. I could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock behind us, and outside a car rolled past on the street with a low rumble. She talked about the elevation gain, the lookout point, the creek crossing that would be nice and shallow this time of year. I only half followed the details, more focused on the soft rasp of her voice and the way she kept glancing at the map like it was calling to her. When she left, the night had settled fully over the neighborhood. The air was cool on my bare arms as I walked her out to her car, the pavement still holding a little warmth under my sandals. Streetlights cast yellow pools on the sidewalk, and a moth bumped clumsily against the bulb of the one closest to my door. She opened her car door, then stopped and leaned on the frame for a second, the interior light outlining her face. "I'll text you tomorrow," she said. "I'm thinking of heading out early on Saturday. I'll send you the plan." Her watch screen flickered briefly as she tapped it, a tiny square of light in the dark. I watched her taillights shrink down the street until they turned the corner and disappeared, leaving the block in a deeper silence. The porch light over my door felt too bright when I went back inside, throwing sharp shadows across the entryway. Later that night, as I lay in bed with the window cracked and the distant sound of a train horn drifting in from somewhere out on the plains, my phone buzzed once on the nightstand. The screen lit up the room for a moment, then went dark again, when I didn't reach for it right away. I told myself I'd read whatever it was in the morning. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks, the cool air brushing against my cheek, and I closed my eyes, not knowing that something in that ordinary quiet had already shifted just enough to never shift back. I knew something was wrong before I was willing to say the words out loud. It started as a small ripple, the kind of unease you brush aside, because the world has its own rhythm, and most days everything finds its way back into place. That Saturday afternoon, the light outside my living room window had turned that soft, late summer gold, the kind that warms the tops of the trees while the shadows underneath grow long and cool. I was shelving a stack of books I'd brought home to catalog later, letting some quiet folk station play through my speakers when I glanced at my phone and noticed a silence I hadn't expected. It wasn't that she was late. Rachel was never rigid about time, but she usually sent a picture from the trailhead after finishing a hike, a small ritual that told me her boots were back on solid ground. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd said she wanted to get an early start, which could have meant anything. A longer route, a detour, maybe a stop for food on the way home. The hours drifted by in that warm, sleepy way weekend afternoons tend to do. A cicada buzzed in the tree outside my window. The faint smell of someone grilling carried across the neighborhood. I moved from room to room with a kind of lazy contentment, never noticing how quiet it had become until the sun dipped lower and the house settled into shadow. Around 6:30, I sent her a quick text. Nothing urgent, just checking in. The message thread stayed blank. I checked her location app without thinking, expecting to see her dot heading toward Denver. Instead, the map spun for a moment and came up empty, as if the signal had been swallowed by the mountains. I refreshed it twice, then set the phone down on the counter and tried to shake off the first pinch of worry. Reception up high was always unreliable. She'd told me hundreds of times not to panic if her signal dropped. Even so, I found myself pacing a little, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional pop of cooling metal in the vents as the evening air settled around the house. By 7:30, the sky outside had faded to a deeper blue, and the windows reflected my own faint silhouette every time I passed them. I called her. It rang and rang, each tone a little sharper than the one before it, until voicemail picked up with that familiar rush of static at the start. I hung up, then called again, this time tapping my fingers against the countertop, feeling the cool laminate under my skin. Still nothing. I told myself she was probably driving. Or maybe she'd stopped somewhere with bad service. Or maybe her phone had died and she hadn't realized it yet. People forget to charge things all the time. I repeated these excuses with more certainty than I felt breathing evenly, like I could somehow steady the situation if I kept my voice calm enough. But beneath all of that rationalizing, something older and heavier began to settle in my chest, a sense that the day had slipped off its track without warning. By 8:30, the streets outside had grown quiet, the warm glow from porch lights pooling on driveways. I stepped out onto my own small porch, the wood boards cool under my bare feet, and listened to the distant hum of a passing car. I dialed again. The call dropped before it even rang this time. That was when the first real crack opened in my composure. I stood there in the stillness, the air carrying a faint scent of dry grass and dust, and whispered, "Come on, Rach, pick up." It sounded thin in the open air, almost swallowed by it. I went back inside and checked her location again. Still nothing. I pressed refresh until the screen blurred. The trail she'd chosen was familiar enough, the kind of place where families took weekend hikes, and where she felt confident going alone if no one else was free. I pulled up the map she'd shown me 2 nights earlier, the image glowing faintly on my laptop, I traced the route with my finger, trying to remember exactly what she'd said about the lookout and the creek crossing. My stomach tightened in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. At a little after 9, I called our mom. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tightness in it as soon as she answered. She told me not to jump to conclusions, her own voice trembling at the edges despite her effort to sound reassuring. Dad got on the line a moment later, asking what time Rachel had planned to be home. I explained everything the texts earlier, the silence since the blank location map. I could hear him breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate the way he does when he's trying to think clearly under pressure. He said he'd go to her apartment just to be sure she hadn't come home and fallen asleep. I waited. Those minutes stretched like hours. I paced through the house with the lights on the shadows stretching long behind me on the hardwood floor. The smell of lemon cleaner still lingered faintly in the living room, mixing with the cool air drifting in through the cracked window. My phone felt too heavy in my hand. When my dad finally called back, his voice was different, quieter, heavier. He said her car was nowhere near the building. Her apartment was dark. Nothing looked disturbed, but nothing looked lived in either. I felt a coldness spread through me, then a slow creep that started at the base of my spine and climbed upward. That was when denial gave way to something sharper. Fear not loud or chaotic, but deep and steady, like a weight settling onto my chest. I told Dad I was getting in the car. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, the metal cool against my palm, and drove north with my headlights cutting a narrow path through the dark. Traffic was thin, just a few cars scattered on the road, their red taillights blinking like small warnings. The sky above Denver had gone almost completely black, except for a faint haze of city light near the horizon. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than I meant them to the leather warm under my fingers. I kept checking the passenger seat where my phone lay, waiting for it to light up. It never did. When I reached the foothills, the air felt different, colder, sharper, carrying the mineral scent of rock and pine even before I reached the trailhead. The lot came into view under my high beams, the gravel dull and pale. And that's when I saw it. Her car parked exactly where she'd said she'd leave it. It looked perfectly ordinary at first glance, just another vehicle resting in the dark. But the closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The windows reflected my headlights back at me, empty and silent. I pulled up alongside it and got out. The moment my feet hit the gravel, the night pressed in around me. The temperature had dropped sharply and the cold bit at my ankles. Crickets chirped in the brush nearby, their sound somehow too loud in the emptiness. I walked slowly to her car, my breath visible in thin bursts under the dim lot light. Everything was locked. I cupped my hands against the glass and peered inside. Her overnight bag sat on the passenger seat, zipped and untouched. Her keys were in the cup holder. Her wallet was tucked between the console and the seat. It looked like she'd stepped away for only a moment. But her phone wasn't there. Her watch wasn't there. And the silence around me stretched out like an open canyon. I tried to convince myself she might have taken a wrong turn and was still on the trail, walking back in the dark. I told myself maybe she'd met another hiker. Maybe she'd stayed up at the lookout to watch the sunset. Maybe. But none of those maybes kept the cold from rising in my throat. I walked toward the start of the trail, the beam of my phone's flashlight shaky in my hand. The wooden sign at the trailhead loomed out of the dark, its carved letters catching the light. The air smelled damp, like the earth had just started cooling after a long day in the sun. I took a few steps onto the path, gravel crunching under my shoes, sending a small echo through the trees. Then I stopped. The forest felt too vast, too silent. I wasn't going to find her by wandering blind in the dark. I made my way back to the car and leaned against the cool metal of the door. My breath came out unsteady, fogging in front of me. I opened my phone and called emergency services. My voice shook despite every effort to steady it. I explained who she was, what she'd planned, what we'd found. The dispatcher asked me to repeat some details, her tone gentle but precise, and I did. I remember staring at the gravel under my feet while I waited for her to confirm help was on the way. She told me to stay where I was. A deputy was coming. By the time I hung up, the night felt heavier than before, as if the darkness itself had thickened around the trailhead. I walked a few slow circles in the lot, trying to keep the cold from settling too deeply into my bones. A breeze stirred the branches overhead, the soft rustle sounding like whispers slipping through the leaves. I looked out toward the tree line, toward the direction the trail disappeared into, and felt the first wave of true helplessness wash over me. It wasn't long before I saw headlights crest the hill, cutting through the darkness in two clean beams. A sheriff's cruiser rolled into the lot gravel, crunching softly under the tires. The lights dimmed, and for a moment everything went still. The driver's door opened and a deputy stepped out slowly, the kind of careful movement that told me he already understood more than I had been ready to accept. He removed his hat as he approached, his silhouette dark against the patrol car's faint glow. And standing there in the cold, with the trees pressing close and her empty car beside me, I felt the world narrow into one quiet certainty. Whatever this was, whatever was unfolding, it had already slipped far beyond anything ordinary. By sunrise the next morning, what had begun as one long, sleepless night had turned into something far larger than any of us could manage alone. The cool air clung to my clothes as I stood in the gravel lot watching the first sheriff's cruisers ease in with their headlights still on beams, cutting pale paths across the trees. The deputies moved with a quiet purpose, their radios murmuring bits of conversation numbers, coordinates clipped confirmations that felt strangely hollow against the backdrop of the mountains. A ranger truck rolled in behind them, its tires crunching softly, and two men stepped out with the steady, practiced movements of people who had searched these hills many times before. I remember the way the early light caught on the metal of their gear carabiners. Radios, thermoses, small glints of silver against the muted greens and browns of the forest. One deputy, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, came over to speak with me. His breath hung in the cold morning air in slow, even clouds. He asked me to walk him through everything one more time, and as I spoke, his gaze kept drifting toward the trailhead, as if some part of him expected my sister to step out of the trees at any moment. There was a heaviness beneath his calm questioning, the kind that told me he doubted we were dealing with something simple. When Mom and Dad arrived, they moved toward me like people stepping gingerly across a broken surface. Mom's hands trembled when she hugged me, her sweater carrying the faint smell of lavender detergent. Dad kept his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the area with a kind of practical urgency he'd always had even when we were kids. We stood together as more vehicles filled the lot, search and rescue teams unloading packs, volunteers climbing out of cars with thermoses of coffee, dogs pacing in circles as their handlers clipped on leads. The scent of exhaust from the trucks mixed with the sharp, resinous smell of pine sap warming in the first beam of sunlight. The rangers laid out maps on the hood of a truck, smoothing the pages with gloved hands as the wind tugged at the corners. Their markers squeaked faintly as they drew lines radiating from the trail Rachel had planned to follow. I watched the ink trace the path she was supposed to have walked, bright strokes across a terrain that suddenly felt unfamiliar. One of the rangers tapped a particular point somewhere near a creek crossing and nodded slowly. I didn't need him to explain why that spot mattered. I could still see her dot freezing there on the app the night before a tiny blue circle that refused to move. Within an hour, the first group set out. Their boots thudded softly against the packed dirt at the trailhead radios, crackling as they checked signals. The dogs tugged eagerly, noses low to the ground, sniffing for any trace of her. I stood by her car, hands shoved into my jacket pockets for warmth, and watched them disappear one by one into the trees. The forest swallowed them quickly. The moment the last one vanished, the lot felt strangely hollow again, as if the silence had crept back to fill the spaces they'd left behind. I followed one of the deputies as he walked toward the start of the trail, just far enough to hear the first calls echo back through the trees. Rachel's name spoken aloud in long, searching tones that faded into the thick air. The sound of it made my chest tighten. It was strange how her name, something so familiar, could feel so fragile when spoken into a place this vast. By mid-morning, a helicopter droned overhead, its shadow gliding across the treetops like a slow-moving cloud. The thrum of its blades vibrated in the air, a steady pulse that reminded me of a heartbeat far too loud to ignore. I tilted my head back and followed its sweep, watching as it hugged the ridge, then dipped low over a clearing before banking toward another stretch of forest. The pilot's voice, flat and clinical, filtered through a ranger's radio, nothing visible moving to the next point. With each report that came back empty, the knot in my stomach pulled tighter. A group returning from one of the side trails came in around noon. Their boots were muddy up to the ankles, their expressions set in that neutral stiffness people wear when they're trying not to let disappointment show. One of them mentioned they'd seen a faint impression in a patch of soft earth, something they hoped might be a boot print. For a few seconds my pulse kicked up, but when they compared photos of it to the tread on Rachel's shoes, the shapes didn't match. The relief I'd expected didn't come. Instead, there was only the sinking weight of another false lead. Other teams checked the creek area, wading through water cold enough to sting their legs even through thick pants. They searched the banks, peered under fallen logs, swept their hands through brush that snapped and rustled under their gloves. One of the dogs gave a short, sharp alert near the waterline, its leash jerking tight as it pulled its handler forward. A surge of hope nearly knocked the breath out of me, but after a few minutes of circling the same patch of ground, the dog grew quiet again, its tail lowering as if whatever it had caught had slipped away as quickly as it appeared. Standing on the bank, I felt the cold mist from the creek brush my face. The scent of wet earth was strong, metallic, and clean like rain on stone. I kept imagining her there, pausing to tie a bootlace, adjusting her pack, taking a sip from her water bottle. But no matter how hard I tried, the picture never resolved into anything that could explain what had actually happened. Throughout the day, deputies spoke in low tones, asking passing hikers if they'd seen a woman on the trail the day before. Some remembered crossing paths with someone who matched her description. Others weren't sure. A few offered hopeful guesses that perhaps she'd taken a longer loop or stopped at an overlook to rest. But as the hours wore on, those guesses felt thinner and thinner, like too much light shining through old fabric. Around mid-afternoon, news began to spread through town. By the time I checked my phone, there were already missed calls from friends and neighbors, people who'd heard there was some kind of search happening in the foothills. A few drove up just to bring water bottles and granola bars for volunteers. Someone I barely knew pressed a small packet of tissues into my hand, her palm warm and shaky against mine. It struck me then how quickly fear can ripple through a community. The air felt different, charged, unsettled. Even the birds seemed quieter, their calls abrupt and sparse. Theories began to swirl before the sun had even begun to set. Some came from volunteers passing whispered thoughts between themselves while waiting for assignments. Others came from hikers standing by their cars, leaning against tailgates and speaking in low voices. Maybe she'd turned her ankle. Maybe she'd slipped near the creek. Maybe she'd wandered off trail to take a photo and couldn't find her way back. People spoke gently, careful not to sound grim. But the space between these suggestions felt tense, as if everyone sensed an explanation that no one wanted to name. A few deputies exchanged looks. They didn't think I noticed small, cautious glances that said they were trying to stay hopeful but failing. When one of them mentioned the weather, how the temperature would drop quickly after sundown, I felt that cold edge of fear climb higher in my chest. The air had already begun shifting, carrying a cooler wind down from the ridges. That wind brushed against the back of my neck, raising goosebumps under my collar. Teams kept returning in cycles, muddy, tired, their radios crackling with static. Every time a group stepped out of the trees, I found myself searching their faces for any sign of news. And every time the same quiet shake of the head met me. Some looked down at their boots. Some glanced away quickly. Others tried to offer gentle words. "We'll keep looking," still covering new ground. Their voices were steady, but the fatigue behind them was impossible to miss. Late in the afternoon, a ranger found what he thought might have been a piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was small, pale, fluttering slightly in the breeze. My heart kicked harder than I wanted it to. But when he examined it closer, it turned out to be nothing more than a torn scrap from someone's old trail marker, a bright plastic remnant that meant absolutely nothing. It was almost embarrassing how relieved and disappointed I felt at the same time. The day dragged on like that, hopes rising, falling, then rising again for reasons too small to make sense. And all the while, the forest around us stood quiet and unchanged, indifferent to the urgency unfolding at its edge. I remember standing near the trailhead as the sun dipped low, the sky turning that burnt orange that makes the tops of the pines glow. The air smelled like dust cooling on rock. Volunteers murmured softly among themselves, their words blending with the distant hum of the helicopter's final sweep. By evening, maps were spread across the hoods of several trucks, each one marked with new lines and circles areas crossed off areas still to cover. The hum of radios had become constant, a backdrop of clipped voices and static that seemed to crawl under my skin. I stood near the ranger table, the cold seeping into my legs from the ground beneath me, as one of the officials traced a fingertip along a narrow draw they planned to search next. His hand paused for a moment, hovering over the paper as if something about that stretch of land unsettled him. I watched him exchange a quiet word with another deputy. They leaned over the map together, their brows furrowing, their expressions tightening in a way that made my breath catch. I stepped a little closer, trying to hear the radio call that had just come through. A hiss of static, a clipped phrase, something about a possible sign, nothing clear enough to make sense of yet. But the look the deputy gave me when he straightened, soft but sober as he folded the map under his arm, told me something had shifted. Something in the pattern of the day had cracked open just enough for a darker possibility to slip through. He took a slow step toward me, the gravel crunching under his boot, and in his hand he carried a small evidence bag empty for now, but held in that careful way that meant he expected to use it soon. The wind picked up behind me, brushing the branches overhead, and for a long moment no one said anything at all. It was in that silence, with the sky dimming and the air turning colder by the minute, that I felt the first true tremor of what was coming, a sense that the forest was holding something just out of sight, and that we were about to find the first thread of it. The shift happened so quietly at first that most of us didn't notice it. Late afternoon light filtered through the pines, thin and amber settling across the search maps spread over the truck hoods. Volunteers were returning in slow, tired waves, boots, scuffed jackets, dusty the air around them, carrying that dry mineral smell of the high country. I was standing near one of the ranger vehicles trying to make sense of the newest grid they'd marked, when a call cracked over a radio, not loud, not frantic, just a clipped interruption that froze the ranger beside me mid-sentence. Another call followed, sharper this time. I felt the hairs on my arms lift. A deputy near the tree line stopped walking, his hand pressed to the mic on his shoulder. His face tightened in a way that didn't match anything we'd seen earlier. Then he turned toward the rest of us and lifted one arm, motioning for the lead ranger. No one spoke. For a few long seconds, all I heard was the dry whisper of wind pushing through branches overhead, a sound too soft against the sudden weight that settled over the lot. I didn't know what they'd found. No one did yet, but the air changed. You could feel it the way people do when a truth has surfaced somewhere just out of sight. The lead ranger jogged toward the trail, his boots thudding lightly against the dirt, and other deputies followed in quick strides. I stepped forward without realizing it, my breath short, my palms cold. One of the younger searchers brushed past me, his face pale and focused, and murmured, "They want the area cleared." Those words hollowed me out. We were told to hold back as the group disappeared into a thick patch of timber beyond a shallow rise. The forest swallowed them first, their shapes, then the last glint of light on their gear, and left the rest of us standing in uneasy silence. I could hear my own heartbeat loud and steady, the sound pulsing in my ears like it belonged to someone else. Minutes stretched. A murmur of voices drifted faintly from the direction the deputies had gone too far to understand, but close enough to stir the tension tightening across my chest. I stared at that patch of trees, waiting for movement, for someone to come back and tell us it was a false alarm, a mistaken alert. Instead, another radio message cut through the air, firmer this time. Then a phrase I'll never forget, even though it was spoken low. "We've got something." A ranger jogged back toward us. His breathing was quick, his jaw tight, the gravel crackling hard under his steps. He didn't meet my eyes at first. He spoke to the senior deputy in a steady but subdued voice, and though I couldn't hear the words, I knew from the slope of his shoulders that whatever they'd found wasn't small. When he finally looked at me, the softness in his expression struck harder than anything else. They didn't want me going in, not yet. But I followed as close as they'd allow, far enough back to respect the boundary they needed, but near enough that the forest sounds wrapped around me, twigs snapping under boots, leaves stirring under careful steps, the faint rattle of branches as someone brushed past. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved into denser shade, the cool dampness settling against my neck. We reached a narrow sloped gully, carpeted in old pine needles, the kind that soften each footfall until the forest feels padded and strangely muted. Sunlight barely reached that spot. It came through in thin, pale ribbons that barely warmed the ground. Deputies crouched low among the brush, their gloves brushing aside layers of needles with slow, deliberate movements. A few feet away, someone held up a hand, signaling for quiet, though no one had made a sound. I couldn't see everything from where I stood, but I saw enough to understand. Something small lay half hidden near a tangle of roots and stones, at first just a dark shape against the earth smeared with mud and grit. A deputy leaned in, brushing the soil gently from its edges. The soft scrape of his glove against the glass made my stomach twist. It was a watch, a cracked black screen, a band mottled with dirt. I felt the world tilt. A sudden rush of cold shot through my chest, and the breath I drew didn't seem to reach my lungs. My hands trembled, fingers curling tight against the side of my jacket. The forest around us seemed to still entirely, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The deputy lifted the watch with careful precision, sliding it into a clear evidence bag, like it was something fragile or sacred. Even from a distance, I recognized the shape of it. The size. The faint scratches along the edge of the frame. The same style she'd worn every day. The same one she'd had on her wrist when she left that morning. My knees wobbled. Someone put a steady hand on my back to keep me upright, the warmth of their palm cutting through the cold air for just a moment. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I could do was stare at that bag, watching it sway slightly in the deputy's hand, catching a sliver of light through the cracked face. The forest's quiet deepened to something almost suffocating. No wind, no birds, just the low hum of radios and the rustle of gloves sealing evidence. They cleared a wider circle around the site, marking trees with bright tape calling for additional personnel. More voices filtered through the brush, firmer now, more urgent, but still controlled. A forensic tech moved in with a small kit, her breath visible as she knelt beside the roots, examining the ground for impressions or signs of disturbance. I stepped back, unable to take in more. The world felt narrowed to that one object and the terrible knowledge it carried. That watch had been on Rachel's wrist when she walked into these mountains, and now it lay cracked and half buried in a place no hiker would have accidentally dropped it. As more officers gathered, the truth began to take shape. Not through words, not through any single statement, but through the way these trained professionals moved, how their postures shifted, how their eyes hardened with a quiet comprehension. This wasn't a lost item recovery. This was evidence. This was the first real sign that whatever had happened to her was not an accident. One of the techs approached the lead ranger and murmured something too low for me to hear. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward me. A moment later, the evidence bag was passed carefully to another deputy, who turned it over in his hands, the cracked screen reflecting a pale sliver of sky. He walked toward me with a measured, deliberate step. I could hear each crunch of gravel under his boots. When he reached me, he paused, removed his hat, and spoke in a tone meant for soft truths that land hard. What he said wasn't a full explanation that would come later, but the words pressed into me all the same. They had reason to believe the watch hadn't been lying there since the day she vanished. The dirt around it was disturbed in ways that suggested it had been placed or dropped days after, and whatever activity was still stored inside the device, they couldn't explain it yet, but they would get the data analyzed as soon as possible. That was the moment my fear hardened into something colder, sharper, something that climbed into the space just behind my ribs and has never entirely left. They sealed off the entire gully. Yellow tape fluttered lightly in the breeze that had finally returned its faint plastic rustle loud against the hush of the forest. Officers moved with absorbing concentration, setting markers, photographing every inch of ground, searching for any sign, any at all, that could tell them how the watch came to rest there. Mom and Dad arrived not long after, escorted past the outer perimeter. The look on my mother's face when the deputy told her what they'd found will stay with me for the rest of my life. Her hand flew to her mouth, her breath catching in a sound that was neither cry nor gasp, just raw pain breaking open. Dad reached for her immediately, pulling her against him. But the way his shoulders slumped told me he'd felt the blow just as deeply. I stood beside them. The three of us held together by hands that shook despite how hard we tried to stay steady. Officers spoke quietly, gently, but the words blurred in my ears. All I could see was the bagged watch resting on a small evidence table, now its cracked screen facing upward like an eye that had seen too much. They worked until the last of the light drained from the sky flashlights, casting long beams across the trees, turning branches into silhouettes that looked almost human. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting when I inhaled. My legs ached from standing, but I couldn't make myself move. When the searchers finally pulled back for the night, the lead ranger approached us with a solemn calm. They'd continue at first light, he said. They'd bring in a specialized team, and the digital forensics unit would take the watch straight to the lab. We were asked to return to town for a briefing. The lights of the cruisers flickered across the trunks as we walked back toward the lot, and I felt strangely untethered, as if the ground beneath me had shifted in a way I couldn't correct. Back near the vehicles, someone handed me a bottle of water. I couldn't drink it. My throat felt closed, my hands stiff with cold. As the last ranger pulled the tape across the trail entrance, sealing it for the night, I understood in a way I hadn't before. Whatever lay ahead would not lead us back to the life we'd known. This was the start of a long night, one that would end not with comfort or clarity, but with the beginning of answers we weren't prepared for. In the hours after the watch was found, everything moved with a kind of quiet urgency, as though the entire mountain had shifted into a different rhythm. Deputies strung fresh tape across the trail entrance, the yellow strips snapping lightly in the cold wind. The sun had slipped behind the ridge, leaving the forest in a blue-gray half-light that made every shape feel closer than it was. I remember standing there with my parents, the three of us grouped together like people bracing against a storm that hadn't fully arrived yet. The gravel under my shoes felt unsteady, as if even the ground didn't know how to hold what we'd just learned. The investigators spoke gently when they explained what needed to happen next. Specialized teams would continue through the night. Digital forensics would analyze the device to pull every last fragment of data it held. A deputy led us to a cruiser to take our statements again. his voice low and steady, the heater blowing warm air that barely touched the cold sitting in my chest. I could still see my mother's hands trembling in her lap, though she tried to keep them folded neatly as if order might soften the blow. Dad stared straight ahead, jaw tight, the muscles in his cheek twitching every so often like he was trying to keep something from breaking loose. News spread quickly. By the time we reached the sheriff's office, a few local reporters were already waiting outside, their breath floating in small white clouds in the night air. Camera lights flickered against the building's brick wall. At first, deputies kept them back, but whispers traveled fast. Search renewed evidence found investigation widened. I heard one reporter murmur something about the missing nurse, and I had to turn away before the weight of those words knocked the wind out of me. Inside, the fluorescent bulbs cast a thin, pale light across the briefing room. Officers moved in and out with quiet purpose, their radios hissing softly. Papers shifted maps where unfolded phones rang with the muted chime of urgency. We sat together at a small table while investigators pieced through the timeline again when she'd started her hike, the last text the moment her location froze the long hours that followed. Every detail felt like a stone being set on my shoulders one after another. The digital analysts worked through the night. The air in that small room grew warm from the machines mixing with the faint scent of old carpet and burnt coffee. When the results finally came in, the lead investigator walked in with a printout in his hand. He lowered himself into a chair across from us, folding his fingers carefully around the page. His voice was soft but clear when he explained that the device hadn't gone dead when we believed it had. The watch had recorded a spike in heart rate around the time her location froze, sharp, sudden, unmistakable, and then in the days after scattered flickers of movement. Strange, inconsistent readings, just enough to unsettle every theory they had held on to. It didn't mean she had survived for days, he said. It only meant someone or something had handled the device during that time. The data couldn't tell them who. It couldn't tell them why. But it was enough to confirm what none of us wanted to believe: Rachel hadn't simply fallen or lost her way. Someone had been close enough to that watch long enough to leave a digital imprint behind. Those findings should have pointed the way to answers. Instead, they opened a deeper fog. Deputies questioned hikers, cabin owners, campers, anyone who had been within miles of that trail in the days after she vanished. They combed through license plates, logged at the trailhead, pulled phone tower records, reviewed hours of footage from neighboring counties. Nothing led to a suspect. Nothing even hinted at one. The mountains, so open and sprawling, had somehow managed to swallow every trace of a human presence except for that watch, and even it spoke in riddles. Weeks slid by. The search teams thinned as winter crept down the peaks, dusting the trail with early snow. Volunteers who had shown up every day gradually returned to their jobs, their families, their routines. The sheriff's office moved from daily updates to weekly ones, then to something more somber, a notice that the case would remain active but suspended until spring. The town seemed to shift under the weight of uncertainty. At the library, regular patrons paused longer than usual at the front desk, their voices dropping when they asked how my family was holding up. Some brought casseroles as though food could fill the hollow place grief had carved out. Others left flowers in places she used to frequent: the coffee shop near the hospital, the bench overlooking the artificial lake near downtown. Every gesture was kind, but each one reminded me of the silence we were living alongside. My parents retreated into quiet routines. Mom began watering her plants twice a day, her hands lingering over each leaf, as though the care might anchor her to the world. Dad spent long hours in the garage with the door cracked open, the sound of sandpaper rasping against wood drifting into the driveway. Neither said much, but we sat together often, sharing the same space because none of us knew how to carry the weight alone. As winter deepened, I found myself drawn back to the trailhead. I'd drive up the winding roads, the heater humming against the cold windows, and park near the wooden sign she'd stood beside. Some days I walked the first stretch of trail until the snow got too thick to navigate. The forest felt different then, stripped down to bare branches and frozen earth, every sound sharper, the air crisp enough to sting my lungs. I'd stop near the creek crossing and listen to the thin trickle of water under the ice, imagining her boots stepping across the stones. It was a sound I knew she would have paused to appreciate. When spring returned, the search resumed in a limited way. Once again, the helicopters skimmed the ridges. Once again, dogs traced looping patterns through the brush. But nothing new surfaced. The mountain yielded no secrets, no remains, no discarded clothing, nothing to connect the dots that still refused to align. The case was studied, reopened, re-examined, and still the same void stared back at us. Over time, the investigators came to believe that Rachel had encountered another person that afternoon, someone who knew how to move through the forest without leaving a trail, someone who had enough familiarity with the terrain to slip in and out without being seen. There were speculations, theories, whispers in the community about drifters, hunters, loners who lived off the grid. But there was never a name, never a face, never a line of evidence solid enough to bring anyone into a courtroom. Rachel became a photograph on a bulletin board at the sheriff's office, a smiling woman in the kind of picture people take when the world still feels whole. And yet, despite the lack of resolution, the case never faded. Her face stayed on the news from time to time. Her story circulated on podcasts and true crime forums. Every time the weather warmed, strangers returned to the trailhead with printed maps and determination in their packs, hoping to stumble upon the detail that had eluded everyone else. As for me, I learned to live with the uncertainty. Not by accepting it, but by carrying it the way a person carries old injuries gently, quietly, with an understanding that healing and ache can coexist. I kept my job, though I moved slower through my days, more aware of how fragile they are. I took long drives through the foothills, windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of pine and thawing earth. Sometimes I felt close to her out there, as though the wind itself held pieces of her voice. Our family found new routines, ones shaped by absence rather than presence. We gathered on her birthday each year, lighting a candle at the trailhead, letting its small flame flicker against the wind. We talked about her hikes, her patience, her laugh, always quiet, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile balance we'd built around her memory. What I came to understand slowly and painfully is that closure is not something everyone gets. Some stories do not end. They simply stop, leaving their echo behind for those who remain. That watch the cracked screen. The dirt caked into the band became the last piece of her, the world handed back to us. I sometimes imagine the moment it slipped from her wrist, the small sound it must have made hitting the ground, the way the forest closed in around it. Even now, years later, that image rises in my mind when I least expect it. Sunlight fading through the branches, pine needles shifting under a gloved hand, and the quiet thud of a truth none of us were ready to receive. It is the sound of a life interrupted, a story forever unfinished, carried on the breath of the mountains she loved. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.